If you have ever walked down a Georgian street in Bath, or Edinburgh's New Town, or almost any market town in England with a stone terrace on it, you have walked past the evidence and probably not registered what you were looking at. A window that is not a window. A neat, rectangular panel of brick or render, set into the facade exactly where a window should be, framed by the same stone surround as the real ones on either side of it and filled in. There are thousands of them. On some streets, they're on nearly every building. And for 155 years, a great many of them were there for one reason. A tax collector could count them from the pavement without ever coming inside. This is the story of the window tax, how a government decided that the fairest way to measure a man's wealth was to count the holes in his walls, what happened to British buildings as a result, why doctors spent the 1840s arguing that the tax was killing people, and why the phrase everyone associates with it almost certainly has nothing to do with it at all. It is also, underneath, a story about a problem no treasury has ever solved. If you tax a thing you can see in order to reach a thing you cannot, people will change the thing you can see. Start in 696 with a king who needed money and a parliament that had just killed the last tax that worked. William III had a war with France to pay for and a currency in crisis. The silver coinage had been clipped so comprehensively, shaved at the edges, coin by coin for decades, that the money in circulation was worth a fraction of its face value. The Great Recoinage was underway, and it was enormously expensive. The Crown needed a new source of revenue, and it needed one that Parliament would actually pass. That last part was the difficulty, because the obvious candidate had just been abolished, and abolished for reasons everybody remembered. The half-tax had been introduced in 1662 under Charles II, 2 shillings a year on every fireplace. On paper, it was a rather good tax. Fireplaces correlate with the size of a house. The size of a house correlates with wealth, and unlike income, a chimney cannot be hidden or moved abroad. The trouble was the collection. To count a man's hearths, you had to go into his house. The collectors, universally loathed and known as chimney men, had a statutory right to enter and inspect, and they used it. They walked through parlors and bedrooms and kitchens, counting fireplaces, in a country that had a strong and articulate view about what an Englishman's home was. The resentment was ferocious, and it was political. When William and Mary took the throne, one of the earliest acts of the new reign in 1689 abolished the hearth tax explicitly as a badge of slavery upon the whole people. That phrase is in the legislation. The tax was not repealed because it raised too little. It was repealed because of how it felt. So by 1696, the Treasury had a specification, and it was an unusual one. They needed a property tax that tracked the size of a dwelling, and they needed it to be accessible without a single collector crossing a threshold. Somebody looked at a house from the outside and counted the windows. It is genuinely an elegant solution. Windows are a fair proxy for the size and quality of a building. Glass was expensive, so more windows meant more money. They are permanent, visible from the public highway, and impossible to conceal at the moment of assessment. A surveyor could walk a street, count, and be done, and no householder would ever have to let him in. The Act of 1696 set it up in 2 parts, and that structure matters for everything that follows. There was a flat rate of 2 shillings on every house, which almost everybody paid. Then there was a supplementary charge that depended on how many windows you had, an extra 4 shillings for a house with between 10 and 20 windows, and an extra 8 shillings for a house with more than 20. Note what that produces. Below 10 windows, nothing extra. At 10, 4 shillings. Not a gentle slope, but a step, a cliff edge in the tax code, and the entire behavioral history of the window tax follows from those cliffs. Because a man with 11 windows had a very obvious course of action available to him. He could brick one up. And they did immediately, not as a marginal, occasional dodge, as a routine, sensible, widely understood response to a step in a tax schedule. Householders sitting just above a threshold blocked windows to drop below it. The work was cheap, permanent, and entirely legal. You were not evading a tax, you were declining to incur one. The government's response, over the next century, was to keep raising the rates and keep moving the thresholds, and the householder's response each time was to block more windows. The tax was increased repeatedly. In 1747, the structure was overhauled, the flat house duty was kept, but the window element was recast as a charge per window above a threshold, which was set at 10. That change is the important one because it converted a small number of cliffs into a continuous incentive. Under the old scheme, blocking a window only helped if it took you across a boundary. Under the new one, every single window you removed above the threshold saved you money every year, forever. The rates then went up again and again. There were increases in 1758, 1761, 1766, 1779, 1784, 1797, and 88. By the early 19th century, the tax had been raised something like 6 or 7 times in 60 years, and at its peak, it was a serious annual charge on an ordinary household rather than a nuisance. The threshold moved too. In 1766, it came down from 10 windows to 7, which pulled a whole class of modest houses into the charge for the first time. In 1825, it went back up so that houses with fewer than 8 windows were exempt, which pushed a great many of them back out again. Every one of those movements produced a corresponding wave of bricklaying in one direction or the other, up and down the country. It is worth trying to put a figure on what that meant to an actual household, though the exercise needs a warning attached, because converting 18th century money into modern equivalents is a genuinely contested business, and any single multiplier is a simplification. Still, the shape is clear enough. At the start, in 1696, the flat charge of 2 shillings on a house was a modest annual imposition, irritating, not ruinous. By the early 19th century, after 7 decades of increases, a middling town house with 20 or 30 windows could be facing an annual bill that represented a serious line in a household's accounts, comparable to other substantial recurring costs of running a home. For a tradesman or a clerk, this was not a rounding error, it was a sum you thought about. And the crucial feature is that it recurred. A window was not taxed once when it was cut, it was taxed every single year for as long as it existed. That is what made the arithmetic of bricking up so compelling, because the cost of blocking an opening was a one-off payment to a bricklayer, while the saving continued indefinitely. A householder only needed the tax to persist for a few years for the work to pay for itself, and the tax persisted for 155. Nobody blocking a window in 1780 was making a dramatic gesture of protest. They were doing a straightforward calculation with an obvious answer. That is the thing to hold on to about the blocked windows. They are not the residue of a single decision. They are the sediment of 150 years of a schedule being adjusted, and householders adjusting back. Now, What counts as a window? This sounds like a pedantic question. It was, in practice, the central operational problem of the entire tax, and it generated a body of rules and disputes that ran for decades. If a tax is levied on windows, the state must define a window with enough precision that a surveyor standing in the street and a householder standing behind it can be made to agree. And the definition kept failing because buildings are more varied than any definition. Was a skylight a window? Yes, eventually it was. Was a hole in a dairy wall to let air into the cheese room a window? The dairy trade argued strenuously that it was not, and after long complaints, certain agricultural openings were granted exemption. Was a shop front a single sheet of glass 12 feet wide, one window or several? Was a bricked-up opening clearly a window once, plainly not now, taxable? There was a long-running argument about internal light. In a deep house, a room in the middle has no external wall, so builders would put an opening between it and a lit room, borrowing daylight. The revenue's view, at various points, was that if it admitted light, it was accessible, which meant a family could be taxed for a hole in an internal wall between two of their own rooms. And there was the question of what happened when two windows were close together. The rule that emerged, roughly, was that light separated by less than a certain distance of masonry counted as one window. So builders started designing windows in tight clusters, several openings sharing a single frame, mullioned closely enough to be assessed as one. You can see the result on buildings from the period, unusually wide, gridded windows with slim divisions, which looked like a stylistic choice and were in fact a tax calculation rendered in stone. That is the pattern that runs through the whole history. Every rule the revenue wrote to close a gap changed how buildings were designed. The tax did not merely sit on top of British architecture, it got into it. Scotland came under the tax in 1748, some 40 years after the Union, and the effect there is especially visible because so much of Edinburgh's new town went up while the tax was in force and at high rates. Walk those streets and the blocked openings are everywhere in dressed stone, done neatly, done to match. And this is the point at which honesty requires a caveat, because the window tax has attracted a great deal of folklore and not all of the blocked windows you see are its work. Some blind windows were never windows. Georgian architecture is obsessed with symmetry, and a facade often demanded an opening in a position where the internal layout could not accommodate one, behind a chimney breast or a staircase or a party wall. Architects put in a blind recess to keep the rhythm of the front intact. Those are design features, and they predate, postdate, and coexist with the tax. Some were blocked much later for entirely unrelated reasons. A floor inserted, a room subdivided, a neighboring building erected against the wall. So the rule of thumb, if you want to read a building honestly, is to look for signs of a change of mind. A blind window that was always blind usually has no sill worn by weather, no evidence of a frame, and brickwork that is bonded into the wall as part of the original build. A window that was blocked for tax usually has the original sill and surround intact, a frame line, sometimes even the stubs of glazing bars, an infill that is visibly a later insertion, different brick, different mortar, sitting proud or recessed from the face. When you know what to look for, they are unmistakable, and there are a great many of them. It is worth spending a moment on how the thing was actually administered, because the machinery explains a good deal of the behavior. Assessment was done by surveyors working under local commissioners of taxes, and the survey was exactly what the name suggests: a man walking the parish with a list, counting. The householder then had a right of appeal to the commissioners, and the appeals were frequent because the definitional questions were genuinely unsettled and the sums were not trivial. Crucially, you could not simply block a window and stop paying. The system required notice. A householder who stopped up an opening had to declare it, and the stopping had to be done properly, permanently, in solid material, not with a shutter or a board that could be taken down again in the summer. And there were penalties for reopening a blocked window without declaring it, because otherwise the obvious dodge was to brick up in assessment season and knock through afterwards. That requirement is the reason the blocked windows are so well made. If the infill had merely needed to look convincing from the street, householders would have used the cheapest thing to hand. Instead, the rule demanded permanence, and the surveyor came back. So the work was done in matching brick or matching stone, bonded in, finished properly, which is precisely why it is still there and still legible 2 centuries on. The tax specified its own archaeological record. There were exemptions, and they tell you what the state thought it was doing. Buildings used purely for manufacture or agriculture could escape the charge. Dairies and cheese rooms, after sustained complaint, got relief for openings that were plainly for ventilation rather than living. Hospitals, almshouses, and certain charitable institutions were relieved. And, the important one, households, too poor to be liable for church and poor rates were generally exempt as well. That last exemption is often cited as evidence that the tax was not really regressive, and it is a fair point as far as it goes. The very poorest householders did not pay. But it does not reach the tenement problem at all, because in a tenement, the person assessed was the landlord, and a landlord's liability had nothing to do with the poverty of his tenants. The exemption protected the poor who occupied their own dwelling. It did nothing whatever for the poor who rented a room in somebody else's. And there is a second tax in this story that almost nobody mentions, which made everything worse and which ran alongside the window tax for 100 years. Glass itself was taxed. Taxed! The glass excise arrived in 1746, and it was, if anything, a more damaging piece of design than the window tax. It was levied not on the finished pane, but on the weight of the materials the glasshouse used. Tax the raw weight, and every glassmaker in the country is immediately given a reason to make glass as thin and as light as he possibly can. Which is exactly what happened. The excise pushed British glassmaking towards lighter, thinner products and smaller panes, and it kept the price high for a century. Excise officers were stationed in the glasshouses themselves, weighing, checking, recording. The industry operated under permanent supervision. So consider the position of an ordinary householder in, say, 1800. To put a window in his wall, he must buy glass that carries an excise duty which has inflated its price substantially. Having installed it, he must then pay an annual tax for the privilege of having installed it. The material is taxed and the aperture is taxed. It is difficult to think of a clearer instance of a state taxing the same thing twice by 2 different departments. Put those together, and the arithmetic of blocking becomes overwhelming. A window is expensive to make, expensive to keep, and free to lose. Every incentive in the system points the same way: Fewer windows, smaller windows, darker rooms. The glass excise went first. Peel's government repealed it in 1845, 6 years before the window tax followed, and the effect on the price of glass was immediate and dramatic. Glass became a cheap material almost overnight, and British builders started using it in quantities that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Which produces one of the great ironies in British fiscal history, and it is worth stating plainly because the two events are almost never put side by side. In 1851, the year the window tax was finally repealed, the Great Exhibition opened in Hyde Park in a building made of nothing but glass and iron. Roughly 300,000 panes of it, an acre of ground under a transparent roof, the largest glazed structure the world had ever seen. The Crystal Palace was only buildable because the glass excise had gone. It went up in the same year that the state stopped charging people for their windows, and it stood in the middle of London as a monument, entirely unintentional, to what happens when you stop taxing light. Now, the argument that eventually killed the tax was not about architecture, it was about disease. By the 1830s and 1840s, Britain had industrial cities that were growing faster than anything had ever grown before, and the housing stock in them was appalling. And in that context, a tax that made it financially rational to block up windows stopped being a curiosity about Georgian facades and became something else. The mechanism is straightforward once you see it. In a single-family house, the owner pays the tax and the owner enjoys the light, so at least the person making the decision bears both sides of it. But in a tenement or a subdivided house, let room by room, the landlord pays the tax and the tenants breathe the air. The landlord's incentive is unambiguous. Blocking the windows on a common stair costs him nothing. He values and saves him money every year. So the stairwells went dark, the back rooms went dark, rooms that had been built with ventilation lost it. The medical profession noticed, and the campaign it mounted was one of the more effective public health efforts of the period. Doctors giving evidence to sanitary commissions kept describing the same conditions, courts and closes where the fever ran through every house and where the windows had been stopped up years before. Typhus especially, which was called by a dozen names and which everybody associated correctly in effect, if not in mechanism, with crowded and unventilated rooms. It is worth being precise about what they got right. They did not know that typhus was spread by lice. That came later. Their theory of disease was largely miasmatic, bad air causing illness directly. The theory was wrong. The recommendation was right. Ventilation and light did reduce the disease burden for reasons that had more to do with crowding, washing and vermin than with the air itself, and the doctors campaigning for the repeal of the window tax were arguing for the correct policy on the wrong grounds, which happens more often in public health than anybody likes to admit. The Lancet took it up. Sanitary reformers took it up. The campaign acquired a slogan that did most of the work: a tax on light and air. That framing was devastating, and it was devastating because it was accurate. Light and air are not luxuries. They are not, in any ordinary sense, property. A state that taxes them is taxing something it did not create and cannot justify owning. And once the argument was put in those terms, the tax's defenders were in real trouble. Charles Dickens weighed in Household Words, with a line that circulated widely: "Neither air nor light have been free since the imposition of the window tax." And the political economist came at it from the other side. The window tax was regressive in a specific and demonstrable way. A large country house with 60 windows paid a great deal of tax in absolute terms, but as a share of the owner's income, it was trivial. A crowded tenement in Glasgow or Liverpool, assessed on the windows of a building that housed 9 families, produced a charge that landed through rent on people with almost nothing. Measured per person housed, the poor were paying more, none of which meant repeal was quick. The campaign to kill the window tax ran for most of 2 decades, and the shape of that fight is instructive because it was not a case of a bad idea being exposed and abolished. Everybody involved had known it was a bad idea for years. The obstacle was arithmetic. Motions to repeal came up in the Commons repeatedly through the 1840s, brought by radical and reforming members, and they were defeated repeatedly. Not by anybody arguing that taxing light was good, but by chancellors asking the only question a chancellor can ask, which is what you propose to put in its place. That is the recurring feature of the whole affair. Read the debates, and you will struggle to find a full-throated defense of the window tax on its merits. What you find instead is a series of ministers agreeing that the tax is indefensible in principle and explaining that the Treasury cannot spare the revenue this year. Meanwhile, the evidence kept accumulating and it kept being official. The sanitary inquiries of the late 1830s and 1840s, the reports into the health of towns, the great surveys of urban housing conditions put the window tax into the record as a cause of the conditions they were describing. That mattered enormously because it moved the argument out of the pamphlets and into government paper. When a royal commission tells you that a tax is making disease worse, the tax has a problem that rhetoric cannot fix. The petitions came in from everywhere: medical societies, town councils, parish vestries, builders, ratepayers' associations. The repeal of the glass excise in 1845 sharpened the point rather than settling it, because it removed one of the 2 taxes on a window and left the other one standing there on its own, looking increasingly absurd. And the majorities in the Commons kept narrowing year on year until they stopped being majorities. The break came in the spring of 1851 when the Commons carried a motion for repeal against the wishes of Lord John Russell's government. That is the significant constitutional fact in the story. The tax was not given up by a chancellor who had found a better idea. It was taken off the government by its own supporters in a vote ministers did not want and could not stop, and the administration then had to construct a replacement in a hurry to fill the hole in the budget. What they constructed was the inhabited house duty, and the thing to understand about it is that it was not a clever new invention. It was the tax the state had wanted to levy in 1696 and had been unable to. The window tax existed because in the late 17th century there was no way for the Exchequer to know what a house in Northumberland was worth without sending somebody to find out, 1 house at a time every year, and the state had neither the officials nor the records to do it. Counting windows was a workaround for an information problem. By 1851, that information problem had largely been solved, and solved by other reforms entirely. The poor rate had produced parish valuations. The tithe commutation of the 1830s had produced detailed surveys of property across England and Wales. The new municipal corporations kept records. Between them, over roughly 2 decades, Britain had accidentally built the administrative apparatus for valuing property, which meant a tax on the annual value of a house was now a practical proposition rather than an aspiration. So, the window tax did not fall purely because it was cruel, it fell because it had become unnecessary. The proxy was retired the moment the state could measure the real thing. The Chancellor's difficulty was that the tax raised real money, something on the order of £1, 8 million a year by the middle of the century, and any repeal needed a replacement. The replacement was found, and on the 24th of July 1851, the window tax was repealed and an inhabited house duty put in its place, assessed on the annual value of the property rather than on the count of its openings. That is the crucial change, and it is why the story matters beyond the buildings. The new duty taxed the thing the old tax had been trying to reach all along. The window tax had never been about windows. Windows were a proxy, accountable stand-in for a value that was hard to observe from the street in 1696. By 1851, there was a functioning system of property valuation, so the proxy was no longer necessary and could be dropped. The bricking up stopped almost immediately. Some householders reopened their windows, many did not, because reversing the work cost money and the tax was gone either way. Which is why the evidence survives. Those blocked openings are the fossil record of a tax that stopped being levied 170 years ago. Now, the phrase. Almost everyone who knows anything about the window tax has been told that it gave us the expression daylight robbery. It is a marvelous story. It is very probably not true. The problem is the dates. If daylight robbery had been coined in outrage at a tax imposed in 1696, raised through the 18th century and repealed in 1851, you would expect to find it in the enormous volume of pamphlets, newspaper columns, parliamentary speeches, and satirical prints that the campaign against the tax produced. The campaigners were not shy, and they were not short of material. They gave us tax on light and air. They did not, as far as the record shows, give us daylight robbery. The phrase does not appear in its familiar sense, meaning a blatant overcharge, until the 20th century, decades after the tax had gone. And its literal sense, a robbery committed in daylight rather than under cover of dark, is much older and perfectly sufficient as an origin. The audacity of a thief who does not wait for nightfall is the whole joke. No tax required. This is worth flagging not to be pedantic, but because it is the kind of story that gets repeated by people who are otherwise being careful, and the real history is more interesting than the folk etymology. A government that taxed light for a century and a half does not need an invented catchphrase to make the point. Britain was not alone in any of this, incidentally. Ha 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 ha! France imposed a tax on doors and windows in 1798, 2 years after Britain had raised its own again, and kept it until 1926, a full 75 years after the British repeal, with much the same consequences for French housing. And the general family of taxes is older and stranger than either. Peter the Great taxed beards. Various states have taxed chimneys, carriages, hair powder, playing cards, servants, and clocks. Britain itself taxed bricks from 1784 to 1850, which is why some buildings of the period used noticeably larger bricks than others. The tax was per brick, so manufacturers made them bigger. Every one of those is the same idea. You cannot see income. You can see a beard, a chimney, a brick, a window. So you tax the visible thing and hope it tracks the invisible one. And every one of them produced the same result. The visible thing changed. That is the lesson the window tax teaches better than almost any other episode in British fiscal history, because the evidence is still standing in the street. When a measure becomes the basis of a charge, it stops being a neutral description of the world and becomes a target, and people optimize against it. The proxy decouples from the thing it was chosen to represent. Windows stopped indicating wealth and started indicating a householder's tax position. The modern versions are everywhere once you have the shape of it. Company cars taxed by engine size produce cars with small, hardwired engines. Vehicle duty banded by emissions produces vehicles engineered to perform well in the test that measures emissions. Any rule with a threshold produces a dense cluster of activity just underneath the threshold, whatever the activity is. And the tell is always the same. A rule that was written to describe behavior ends up prescribing it. Nobody in 696 intended to legislate on the design of the British terrace. The Act does not mention architecture. It simply attached a price to a feature, left it there for a century and a half, and let several million individual decisions do the rest. That is how tax policy usually reshapes a country, not by instruction, but by making one option marginally cheaper than another, and then waiting. None of this makes proxies avoidable. In 1696, there was no practical alternative. The state could not value every house in England annually, and it certainly could not observe income. Given the constraints, counting windows from the street was a reasonable answer to a genuinely hard problem, and it raised money for a century and a half. But the cost was not paid in revenue. It was paid in bricked-up rooms in tenements, where a landlord had done the arithmetic, and in the dark stairwells the doctors kept describing to sanitary commissions in the 1840s, and it was paid disproportionately by people who had no say in the decision. The tax was designed to avoid sending a man into your house. It succeeded. What it did instead was reach in through the wall and take the light. So the next time you're on a Georgian street and you see a blind window, original sill, original surround, brick where the glass should be, stop and look at the mortar. If it is a different color from the wall around it, you are looking at a decision somebody made about money, still sitting in the front of a building 2 centuries later. It is one of the few taxes in British history you can still see.